This is an occasional podcast series in the afterlife of my documentary about Samuel Barber. These Capricorn conversations are with composers and musicians whose orbits have intersected with that famous gathering place called Capricorn, where Barbara Minotti also lived. I'm Paul Moon, and this conversation today is with composer Tobias Picker at the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Tobias, thank you for sharing your reflections today.
Sure. Happy to be here.
There are two things about you that I can't resist starting off with. I'll get to your correspondence with Giancarlo Minotti, but first, I noted that from an early age you've said that your favorite composer was Brahms, and there's a concert that one can watch that has been linked to in the episode's description where one can see you playing an intermezzo of Brahms, and when one sees that, one sees a deep connection that you have with Brahms. So I just thought it'd be, as an icebreaker, to sort of geek out on Brahms. I mean, literally to talk about your thoughts on Brahms and the role that he played early on in your life. I can't resist mentioning Samuel Barber's favorite composer, too.
I did not know that Brahms was Barber's favorite composer, but I can understand why Brahms was so special to Barber, and is in just a class by himself, apart from all other composers. Well, I think all truly great composers are in a class by themselves. They are, each one is a silo, let's say, as people say today. I don't even know if that's the correct use of the term silo, but they are in classes by themselves. But Brahms is I hesitate to say, to use the word I'm thinking, because I don't in any way want to belittle Brahms. It could almost sound belittling, but it's not. It's meant in the best sense of the word, that his music is comforting. It's for me, it's comfort music. It's the music of home. It's the music of healing. It's the music through which we can resolve emotional conflict, and with which we can soothe our sorrow, and augment our joy.
It's funny, there was in a biography about Barbara Heyman cited a New York Times critic who, at the turn of the 20th century, wrote something to the effect of, Brahms has written music as if nothing ever happened for 100 years before, as if it was old-fashioned.
That was written about Brahms at the turn of the 20th
19th
century?
into 20th, yeah.
That's interesting, because I've seen other music critics steal that line so many times to put down composers they don't like.
In other words, was Brahms just sort of hearkening to a long begone era?
That's just utter nonsense. I mean, that would be as if to say he was a continuation of Bach. I mean, he was the logical next step after Bach or Mozart. I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. It just makes no sense.
And on a more positive note, is there something unique about Brahms's compositional style that brought something new to music that perhaps is underappreciated? A unique idiomatic sound of Brahms.
Well, it was a new. I think Brahms was a new voice. Brahms' name is, I think, onomatopoetic for his music. It's to say something is Brahmsian. It tells you something already about the music. Mm-hmm. it bathes you in. Well, it's just a fascinating composer. His ideas of counterpoint and rhythm, his use of polyrhythms and counter melody, the inner voice in Brahms is especially. I discovered it in learning the piano music as a child, and how crucial the inner voice is to Brahms. He was able to make to use 3-note leitmotifs and create an entire piece with 3 notes, which is what Opus 118 number 2 does. For me, yes, the soprano voice, as it were, is C sharp B D. That is the motive for the whole piece, but the inner voice is A G sharp F sharp. So everything in that piece is a permutation of the notes A, G sharp, F sharp, including C sharp, B, D, which is a sort of retrograde inversion or something of that. But if you really look into that piece with a microscope, there is not one thing in it that doesn't describe a permutation of those 3 notes, A, G sharp, F sharp. So, yeah, Brahms is like nothing else. And
well, let's talk about another composer because, and I'm so glad I had the pleasure of seeing the actual letter itself. But I'd love to even hear you read it if you'd like. But if we can set it up, tell me the story about your correspondence with the composer Giancarlo Menotti and how it came to be.
Well, Menotti was the first living composers whose music I encountered because I believe it was CBS commissioning, I think, 15 operas.
Or NBC, yeah.
Or was it NBC? By 15 composers to write operas for television. Network television. Just saying that today makes me laugh. How the world has changed since the 50s, and one of those operas was Amal and the Night Visitors, and became the most successful of all 15. I'd love to go back now and look up what the others were. I know Lucas wrote one. Lucas Foss wrote one. I don't remember who I was just a little kid, but I have read about who the others were, but we really only remember Amal, and Amal was on television every Christmas, and I looked forward every Christmas to seeing Amal and the Night Visitors on TV. I later became very close friends and the accompanist of a great dancer named Mary Hinkson, who gave master classes. She was one of the star dancers of the Martha Graham Company, the first one of the group of 3 first black dancers to be hired by Martha Graham, and perhaps by any company in the late 40s, early 50s. And we did master classes together with where I accompanied these dance classes. And Mary, I later learned, was one of the dancers in that original production of Amal and the Night Visitors. And it was unavailable in any other way to me. I had no access to, I didn't have the record. There must have been a recording of it by the early 60s, late 50s, or maybe not, I don't know. It was still very much alive and happening. So it was I memorized a lot of it, and my my older sister, when my parents were on, I think they had gone to Cuba for a vacation, organized a show to put on for them when they returned. So everybody, my brother and my sister and another member of the family, when my parents arrived, put on a show. And on this show, one of the things, it was a variety show, and one of them I was Casper in Amal, and I sang "This Is My Box," using my mother's old-fashioned sewing box, and looking forward to the moment when I could say, "In the third drawer I keep licorice, long black shiny licorice." Right. Have some, and
Casper gets the best laughs.
Yes.
In the opera.
So when I was 8 or 9, I think 8 maybe, I started piano lessons and got my first piano, and I immediately started to improvise and try to compose. I took piano lessons, but I was much more interested in I was very interested in learning to play the music I could read that was written, but I was more interested in figuring out how to write down music that was in my head. And so I knew then that was what I wanted to do, and that was who I was. And my father suggested, why don't you write a letter to Menotti? Maybe he'll answer you. And and so I did, and my father got his address, and my father worked at CBS at the time, so he was able to get his address at Capricorn in Mount Kisco, which was a town 2 towns over from where I grew up in Pound Ridge, New York. I wrote him a letter and talked about my aspirations. I was fascinated by Schubert's life. I was fascinated with composers' lives as a child. My bedtime stories were lives of the great composers. My mother would read to me. I was really interested in, especially in Schubert, and I thought an opera about Schubert. Somehow I imagined this opera about Schubert that I was writing, and so I wrote to him, telling him I was a composer and that I was going to write an opera about Schubert, and he did answer my letter, and I've kept it all these years. It'll be 59 years in a few weeks ago that I received this letter, and it was a very exciting day when it came in the mailbox. When I went to the mailbox, and there was a letter from Capricorn, and it reads, it's on Capricorn stationery, January 5th, 1963, and it reads, "Dear Toby," which is what I was called as a boy, "I was very happy to receive your letter because a long time ago I wrote an opera called The Medium, in which the hero is also called Toby, like you. I share with you a love for Schubert, and I am sure your opera should be most interesting. I'm sorry we cannot meet now," because I'd written saying I wanted to meet him. "But I'm about to sail for France, where my new opera will be performed. However, if you care to get in touch with me again when I return in the fall, I shall be delighted to hear your compositions. My very best wishes for a Happy New Year. Sincerely, Giancarlo Menotti." And that was a big thrill to receive as a how old I was 8. But I didn't know anything about follow-up in those days, and by the fall I was writing to the Central Park Zoo to see if I could get them to give us a baby seal. And but I was still. I mean, I hadn't given up. I think I didn't really feel entitled to show him my compositions because I didn't feel they were good enough to show him yet, or finished enough to show him, to really justify a visit with him. If they were complete compositions, I probably would have had the instinct to follow up and go show him. But who knows, what would have happened if I did.
I think what's going to happen is that you're eventually someday going to finally write that opera about Schubert. And then you're going to use a medium to contact Giancarlo from the grave.
That would be something. I wonder why no one has written an opera about Schubert. I think it's an interesting idea, but I'm not sure that his life was that operatic, but he certainly died tragically young. That's fairly operatic.
Yeah, probably his most marquee named piece is the one that notes his unfinished symphony.
Yes, the branding of unfinished.
The branding of a composer
yes,
is unfinished.
He. I'm sure he planned it all out that way so that it would be unfinished. But there was the story came full circle because 7 years later, when I was 15, I had been studying the piano at the Juilliard Prep all those years, and my high school had a career day. We assembled in the library, and a panel of professionals in the arts spoke to us each about their career, and we could ask questions. So there was Brenda Lewis, who was a soprano from the Met. Paul Henry Lang, the musicologist, was there. Elliot Feld, the choreographer. And I don't remember if there was anyone else, but Giancarlo Menotti was there. And my school was only a few minutes from his house. I don't know exactly where Capricorn was. I couldn't find it, even though I know the area. I don't know where it actually is. But my school was Fox Lane High School, and was in Bedford, New York, which was next town over. So it came to him to speak, and he said, you some of these other professions, you become these things, but if you don't become a composer. You either are a composer or you're not, and if you are a composer, you know that you're a composer. So it's not a profession you choose. And so a light went off in my head, because I suddenly immediately felt I'd been wasting the last 7 years becoming a pianist, so that I could play the Emperor Concerto. I wanted a Steinway. My mother took me to Steinway Hall when I was starting the piano at 8 or 9 to try out all the pianos. And I said, I want one. And she said, when you can play the Emperor Concerto, we'll buy you a Steinway. And so I was motivated, and I played the Emperor Concerto in the Manhattan School of Music concerto competition. And I said, remember back, she said, no, I don't remember that. I said, well, I can assure you, you promised a Steinway if I played the Emperor Concerto. So I got the Steinway. I still have that Steinway. It's a Steinway A, and I still have that piano. It's but I didn't win the competition, concerto competition, and that same year I met Menotti. I went up to Menotti after, when it was all over, introduced myself, and I said, I wrote you a letter when I was 8. My name is Toby. Do you remember? And he said he did remember that letter because nobody else named Toby had written him a letter that said they were a composer. And he was very charming, and I just mainly wanted to know if he remembered the letter. And after that career seminar was over, I went into a practice room in the music department, and I started actually writing down and seriously writing a piano piece, a set of piano pieces. And that day, that really was the day I started to compose in earnest, and I haven't stopped. And so Menotti played an enormously large role in my not becoming a composer, but coming out as a composer.
Realizing your destiny as a composer.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that step along the way when you had certain other composers teaching you to compose, and I see names like Elliott Carter, Milton Babbitt, Charles Warren, and so I know this is a tired narrative, but to the extent you have anything to say about the way that those composers aren't easy listening, they don't sound like Brahms, they don't sound like Menotti, but you did embrace modernism, you did embrace trying out what they did. Is that fair to say?
Yes, more Warren and then Carter and Babbitt, but I was very drawn to Warrenen's music when I was 17, 18, and looking for a teacher. I had no interest in going to liberal arts college. I wanted to study with a composer, and so that meant going to the conservatory where he taught, which was Manhattan School then. And I was, when I discovered his music, I was completely just blown away by it. So it wasn't that I was drawn to modernism. I was drawn just to the world of Warrenen's musical vocabulary and expression, and it was later that I discovered Carter, and later that I discovered Babbitt. But it was Warren that he became my mentor, teacher and mentor.
What role then would you say that both him and also Elliott Carter and Milton Babbitt played in the development of your style? Or is this the narrative of a turning point where the music that we hear today, of the music that your whole body of work, the body of work you're known for, lyrical, tonal, romantic is maybe a word that people can use that's assigned to a genre. I just always am interested to ask composers whether they hear traces of their mentors in their writing.
Some of it isn't tonal. And when it's tonal, my music it's all wrong. I mean, it doesn't follow any rules of tonality for the most part. I mean, I might call it a kind of tonal modernism. And yes, I do hear the fingerprints, or maybe the footsteps would be more accurate of my teachers in my work. Carter and Warren and much more so than Babbitt. I don't feel that I was ever influenced by Milton's music. I mean, he was a wonderful older composer friend to me, and so were the others. But Carter, both Carter and Warren were very we're in the lineage of Schoenberg, and I'm sorry, Stravinsky and Schoenberg. It's hard to say in which order, but in that, I think they both embrace both of those those two lineages, which in a way are separate. So yeah, I do hear it in my work, and the echo of Stravinsky too. Who I think of as the most inescapable influence of the late 20th century.
For contrast, as well as to build on that, can we talk about Old and Lost Rivers, which we also hear in that concert that I had the honor to film you playing the piano, and then we got to hear Mark play the piece for another reading of that work. When did it emerge? And then I'm going to ask, again, because Barber is one reference point, do you feel like it's kind of your adagio for strings? It's a terribly
no, it's not
beloved piece.
I should be so lucky, I should be so lucky, and yeah, I guess I do. I think the adagio is longer, isn't it? It was about 7 or 8 minutes.
Pretty close. Yeah.
It depends who's conducting Old and Lost Rivers. When Christoph Eschenbach recorded it, it was 6.5 minutes. When I wrote it, it was 3 minutes. So it really depends on how it's played, but I guess it is, it might be my adagio for strings, the orchestra version, but the piano version I think of as my prelude in C sharp minor, because Rachmaninoff was always called on to play that, and the only piece of mine that I ever play at the piano is Old and Lost Rivers. I used to play Keys to the City, but I may take up some other pieces of mine now that I'm playing again. But yeah, it has an adagio for strings quality to it.
The circumstances of that piece, of course, being in the midst of a string quartet, the middle movement, but also very young, and it's not as necessarily despairing and heavy as it sounds. In other words, he was kind of pretty happy-go-lucky at that time in his life. It's associated with deep feeling and heavy gravitas, but it's not quite that simple. I wonder whether similarly that composition of yours arose out of not necessarily some heavy biographical moment, but it just was something that came out more or less perfect.
Well, it was an improvisation that I played into a ghetto blaster on record when I pressed the record button, and it's just, in fact, the original improvisation of 3 minutes, which is what the length was when it was born, is being released. I forget the name of the record label, but the actual improvisation is being released as a single later this month to mark the 35th anniversary of the birth of Old and Lost Rivers. I
see. And then how about...
And I did improvise it from beginning to end, and then I just transcribed it. I didn't change anything.
It's fascinating. Where the rivers go, how does that... is it necessarily related to the piece? We hear that in the video concert, too.
It's related because I improvised that entire piece. It's 10 minutes from beginning to end, and transcribed it without changing a note, and it's in its first life, the scene 1 in Act 1 of my first opera, Emmeline. And I later realized, it started out as a piano piece. It should have a life as a piano piece too.
To be honest, this has this great Houdini vibe to it. I just, when you hear these pieces, they sound terribly intricate and accomplished as compositions rather than improvisations. So I'm literally kind of amazed at this moment. I didn't know that this was well known. Maybe it isn't.
That's not well known. I mean, I think I may have talked about this, written about it in a program note, but
can you name another contemporary who can do that, who is an improviser as such, who writes, so to speak, writes melodies that have a genesis in improvisation?
I have no idea. There must be other composers who do. When I started out as a composer, I was also, as I mentioned earlier, playing dance classes for Martha Graham Company and school, and so I was improvising within a very strict structure of Graham technique every day for a few years, and improvising. I knew that improvising was a very crucial part of a composer's arsenal. Beethoven and Mozart all improvised their cadenzas, and when they performed their concertos, the cadenzas used to be improvised. Composers, you had to be able to improvise if you were a composer. Then that's just what people did, and I think a lot of Chopin was just. He would just sit down and play, and his students would transcribe what he wrote, what he was playing, and so it wasn't groundbreaking to do. It was part of a tradition. Whether other composers do that today, I don't. I really don't. I'm not qualified to say. I don't know. Okay. Do you?
Not necessarily. No,
I don't know.
No. I wonder. This is my instinct tells me it's I don't know if rarefied is the right word. A rarefied gift.
I wish I did it more. Well, it's something. It's a zone that once I go into, it's a very difficult zone to enter. It's a little bit spooky.
Well, it's funny because I thought you were going to go in a different direction with that, because I certainly wanted to ask you next, it always fascinates me when you take that, so to speak, big step to opera. First, the question, when is a composer ready to write an opera? Is there a moment in time? Because I would say that now it looks as though you're known for being an opera composer. So,
I think that makes me very sad, actually, because before I ever wrote an opera, I wrote 3.5 piano concertos. The fourth piano concerto was only 5 minutes, and so let's say 3, and 2 or 3 symphonies. I don't really like the third symphony, so I don't really count it. But certainly the first and second. The first for San Francisco Symphony, which they toured with, and the second for Houston, which was recorded when I was composer in residence of the Houston Symphony. A violin concerto, a viola concerto.
Something commissioned for
cello concerto.
Commemorating the Brooklyn Bridge, I remember.
That was my second piano concerto, Keys to the City. 2 string quartets, 2 piano quintets, a lot of chamber music and symphonic music, other symphonic music, melodrama for narrator and orchestra, which I just recorded with the Nashville Symphony, which came out on Noxus, I think, a year ago.
You said it was a co-commission with the National Symphony as well?
Co-commissioned by National Symphony.
When do we get that in Washington?
You had that in Washington.
Oh, we did.
Eschenbach conducted the world premiere on March 10th.
Okay.
2016, and I know that because we scheduled our wedding at the Supreme Court when Ruth Bader Ginsburg married my husband and I, Aryeh Stolman, around going to Washington for the rehearsals and premiere of Opera Without Words. It is called, and then
I love how that already kind of deconstructs the idea that are you an opera composer or what? And it's irrelevant. You're writing operas without words.
Yeah, well, I did take. I hadn't written an straight orchestra piece in years, but so I did bring what I'd learned about lyric music into the orchestral realm. But if I had more time and was more disciplined, I would be writing many things besides operas.
Sure.
But and I hope that I will go back to doing so. I may be known as an opera composer, but even though I'm now finishing the seventh. Maybe there's more. No, there's probably just as much music I've written in terms of musical time. That's not opera. So I'm not sure. I think I interrupted your question, but
No, I think I don't want to dwell on the simplicity of the question either. I think I just want to definitely make sure to talk about Awakenings, which is your forthcoming opera that was deferred by the pandemic and is now going to be premiering in June 2022 in the Opera Theater St. Louis. And it is something that grew out of your friendship with Oliver Sacks, and it is an adaptation of Awakenings. I wonder if one way to sort of arrive at that is to maybe ask you first, what is your relationship with Tourette's syndrome? I mean, how does it interact with your musical life? And I've read Oliver Sacks have some comments on that. Whether, for example, it actually increases productivity, whether it is better be described as a gift.
Oh, well, he thought that, and I can buy that. I bought that idea, and it made me feel better about having it. Whether it's true or not, I have no idea. Mm-hmm. It is a kind of energy that causes that is in control of my body at times, and so when I'm very focused on music, on composing or performing, it leaves me alone, and it is known to do that. Oliver wrote about a brain surgeon, I believe, who had very bad Tourette's, but when he was operating, he was perfectly still. So it could be that it is related to a creative gift. It would be nice to think that there was some benefit to having to be tormented by this really quite annoying at best and almost debilitating neurodivergent, as it's called, syndrome. Because I would much rather have not had Tourette's syndrome as a child, and I would much rather not have it as an adult. I don't like it. I don't enjoy it. So yeah, I mean, if it's Oliver had this romantic notion but Oliver was he liked to make people feel better about being different. That was one of the things that defined him as a great man, because he wrote and spoke so much about normalizing divergence, neurological divergencies, and it did help a lot of people, I think, feel better about themselves and not feel like freaks. So
I mean, in a sense, I feel like you've given the truest and purest artist's answer, because what you're interested in is less of the noise and more about just producing the art that you want to produce. And anything that gets in your way is going to be bad, and anything that helps is going to be good, and all that you're focused on is the music itself. And there it is. But this also means that you know a thing or two about the subject of awakenings, which is not necessarily the same neurology, but they're definitely related. So, in brief, I mean, what happened this outbreak? And of course, these days we can't avoid tying such a pandemic with what's going on these days. And have you done so? Have you thought about the way the world reacted back then and how many died versus what's going on right now?
Oh yes, Awakenings was finished just before COVID hit. So it's complete coincidence that I wrote an opera about a pandemic whose premiere was postponed because of a pandemic. And the pandemic was a pandemic of what was called sleepy sickness, and the scientific term is encephalitis lethargica. It took place, overlapped with the Spanish flu, but it lasted much longer. I think the Spanish flu only lasted 3 years, but encephalitis lethargica, I believe, lasted something like 10, and we don't really know how many people died from it. Oliver was convinced that around 5 million people died from this disease, and very few survived it. But when he was a young neurologist, he got a job at a hospital in the Bronx, and encountered for the first time survivors of the sleepy sickness from the 1920s who were sitting in wheelchairs in a mental ward in the Bronx in 1969, and he became very interested in them and who they were, why they were there, what was causing their dysfunction, and came to the conclusion that it was akin to a kind of Parkinsonism, and was, after fighting for it, given permission to experiment on them with the newly discovered drug L-Dopa, which was being used to treat Parkinson's patients very successfully. And he was able to awaken them after a sleep of 40 years, and they woke up. And they could move, they could walk, they could talk, they could sing, they could dance. If they played the piano before, they could play the piano. But the side effects from the drug were too much for some of them, and they went off of it because they didn't want to. Some of them had side effects of tics that were violently severe, that would to make mine seem like nothing. But I certainly identified with those, how those people were suffering. Just the people whose side effects were uncontrollable tics, very complex tics. He called one person, he said, was a veritable symphony of tics. But I loved this. I loved his book, and I wrote a ballet with Alida Collins, the choreographer for the Rambert Dance Company, about 10 years ago, which toured a whole UK with the live orchestra. That was before I wrote the opera, and that it's musically completely unrelated to the opera.
Are you, as we in the run up to, and if we anticipate the premiere of this opera and how today's probably still lingering pandemic audience deals with it, I suppose there are potential concerns, aren't there? There are some people who are perhaps manufacturing paranoia about medical treatments to solve things like this current pandemic that are distinguishable from what the subject of awakenings. But is there still a positive common lesson that comes out of this? I guess put another way, are there policy insights that your opera are going to help us with? What will this mean to the audience?
That's a really, really good question. It certainly will mean different things and a lot more things to the audience in 2022 when it premieres, assuming it does premiere in June, than it would have in June of 2020 had there been no COVID. Then it would have been a story about an event that took place 100 years ago, far removed from our own experience. But now, every single person attending this opera will have a personal connection to the characters, because all the physicians and nurses, because of having lived through this. So what will it mean to them? I think it will mean like any work of art, it will mean something different to every person, but what it will mean to them is different from, I think, what it would have meant to them had they not had this experience themselves and been touched by the current pandemic in one way or another. So I think the message of it does have a message, the opera, and that is it's a message of hope within despair, hope within sadness. It's in keeping with, I think, the spirit of what we began talking about earlier of Brahms, which I would say, if I had to characterize his music, it's hope within sadness, contained within sadness. And somewhere in this music of Brahms is consolation and hope. And I hope that Awakenings gives the audience something of that experience.
Well, thank you, Tobias. I'm just going to wrap up by asking you just a round robin of a few pieces we heard in your recent concert that were paying a tribute to your career, not just in opera, but as you say, in many other types of instrumental pieces, including chamber works. What would you say in brief about this solo piano piece called The Blue Hula?
The Blue Hula was the middle movement of a 10-minute piece I wrote for a new music group in New York in the early 80s called the New York New Music Ensemble. And I wrote it when I was living in Hawaii in 1980 on commission, and it's scored for Puro plus percussion group. They commissioned a lot of pieces, New York New Music Ensemble. And this I extracted the middle movement because it's jazz, and I haven't written a lot of jazz, but this is one of the jazz pieces that I wrote, beautifully played, I must say, by Mark. Really beautifully played, jazzily played with elegance.
Tell me about 4 etudes for Ursula, one of which we hear, and then, of course, begs the question, which Ursula are we talking about?
It was written for Ursula Oppens, who has been the doyenne of contemporary pianists, contemporary music pianists for the past 50 years in New York, and for whom I've written most of my piano music, and who's recorded most of it.
If we want to find an album, is there a great collection?
There is an album of my piano music that Ursula recorded we recorded Keys to the City, my second piano concerto, a 2-piano arrangement of it that I made. But the rest is her playing solo piano pieces, and it's on a Vergo, WERGO recording and they named the album Keys to the City. 4 pieces, the 4 etudes are on that. I wrote them for her in '96 when I was writing Emmeline.
Something else that you surely wrote for somebody is a piece that's simply called in all uppercase letters, Lenny.
Yes, I was asked to write a piece having to do with Lenny's 100th birthday by a pianist that I didn't know, and who'd asked dozens of composers to write them little pieces in tribute to Leonard Bernstein, and I didn't really want to do that, but although to write a piece for them because I didn't know them, and I didn't also like to write a piece that was one of 40 pieces. So I must someday tell you what Morton Feldman told me about the length that pieces should be and why, but that's another discussion. But I did write the piece finally, but I just didn't want to give it to this other pianist. And Mark Peliquin had such a keen interest in my work that I decided to give it to him. And so it's written for Mark. It was meant for Mark. I never even heard the other pianist play.
Because it's funny now that I hear the background, because it's almost a bit, I don't know if I want to say sarcastic or almost under duress, that it ends with I don't know if there's a music theory term that's equivalent to postscript, but there's a little 2-note postscript at the very end of the piece that actually was programmed nicely in the concert, because eventually we hear Michael Kelly, the baritone, sing a version of Somewhere.
Well, it's based on Somewhere. It's a little variation, a crazy variation on Somewhere.
In other words, it almost sounds kind of rebellious. The composition itself.
It does. It was not originally called Lenny. It was originally called What Happened in the Elevator, because the first time I saw Leonard Bernstein was when I was 9, and my mother took me to a Leonard Bernstein Young People's concert, and it was Andre Watts's debut, playing the Liszt Concerto, which was historic. I mean, at the time, it was big news. It was on the front page of the New York Times. It was such a success, and I was there. I was very excited. I met him 25 years later, 30 years later, and he heard Old and Lost Rivers on a concert he was playing on. That's why we met, and he took it up and he played it all over the world. And I said, I was there at your debut, and he said, don't remind me how many years have gone by. I am. The next time I saw Leonard Bernstein was when I was a grown man in my 30s, in an elevator, going to Boozy and Hawkes, his publisher. I was going there for some reason, and he got in the elevator and was recognized by some women, tourists, or they seemed like tourists, or they were gawking at him, and he turned his body around and his face and into the corner of the elevator and stood like that until his floor arrived, or theirs arrived, and they got off. And so I had originally called it What Happened in the Elevator, but I thought it would require too much explanation, and it's such a short piece, it would take longer to explain the title than to listen to the piece. So I thought just Lenny would be the right thing. I then wrote a birthday piece for Charles Warren, and was played at his 80th birthday, which he actually was around to hear, and that was called Charles. And I wrote another one for Ursula Oppens. I forget which birthday, and called it Ursula. She did a concert for her 75th, maybe. I forget which, but.
One more piece to ask you about is Car Aria from American Tragedy. What's happening in that moment in the opera?
Clyde Griffiths, who's just started working in his rich uncle's shirt factory in upstate New York. He's the poor relation. Has finished his first day at work, and he sees his spoiled rich cousin Gilbert going off in his motor car with these beautiful girls to a party, and he sees them get into the car at the factory, and wants to be him, and he wants to have a motor car, and he wants the American dream, but he goes about it the wrong way.
To conclude, I thought I heard you say that you finished another opera. So what is that, and when will we hear it?
The new opera is called Lily Elba, and it is based on the life of Lily Elba, Einar Wegener, before her transition and her gender affirmation surgery in 1930, which was historic and unprecedented, and also inspired the movie The Danish Girl, and it will be premiered in this time of year, or October, I think, a little less than 2 years from now, at Theater St. Gallen, the oldest opera house in Switzerland. And it's being written for the transgender baritone Lucia Lucas, who is American born and lives in Germany.
Well, Tobias, thank you so much for recording your thoughts at this time, when we look forward to many more compositions to come, and also continuing to go through your catalog and revive them around the world in concerts.
Thank you, Paul.